This is No Hate Radio.
I'm no stranger to the rain. Oh, no. I'm no stranger to the rain.
Thank you for tuning in on the Allendale Equity and Justice Channel to our little show called No Hate Radio. Today on No Hate Radio, I'd like to introduce for our broadcast Dr. Ray Arsenault, who is a longtime professor of history at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, but also a prolific author and an activist in the field of civil rights. And Dr. Arsenault, I'd like for you to introduce yourself to us on the podcast here today on No Hate Radio.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm really encouraged that someone is doing something like this on No Hate Radio. I think we need a lot more of that. Yeah. And so I'm happy to talk about any of these issues, which sounds like you've got a long list, a big agenda
we do.
To deal with in these troubled times.
And would you give us a little of your, I glossed over it, but a little of your background that you and I have discussed here?
I'm a New Englander, native New Englander from Cape Cod, where my family has lived for centuries. And but my father was in the Navy, and I lived many different places before I graduated from high school. Went to 12 different schools, most of them in the South, Virginia, Florida. And whenever my father would go on board an aircraft carrier, he was a photographer, he'd run this photo labs, we'd go back to Cape Cod. We might be in Pensacola, we might be in Norfolk, we might be in Jacksonville. We'd go back for 2 years, and he'd be gone, traveling around the world. This contrast between the cradle-to-grave segregation, which I encountered in the southern communities, full-blown Jim Crow South, and what I saw on Cape Cod, which was no racial nirvana, but the town where I happened to be born, Harwich, was 35% Cape Verdean, kind of mixed race people who'd been brought in for the whaling industry in the late 19th century and to pick cranberries, and they were very, very well integrated into the town life. They were teachers and lawyers and elected officials, and it was about probably as integrated a community as you'd find in the United States in the 1950s. So the contrast for me was extraordinary, and I had to figure out, where do I fit in all this? What's my identity? So I've spent most of my upbringing as a northern boy in the southern setting. And I think that's the origin for my deep interest in regional culture and race. And I knew that my family some of them had been abolitionists in the 19th century, and it's kind of a racial liberal tradition in my family, which I came to identify with. But it was not easy to be the kind of the odd person out oftentimes. So anyway, that's the origin. I married into an old, prominent Southern family, which complicated things considerably, and went off to college at Princeton, and was very fortunate to become the research assistant for one of the leading civil rights Southern history scholars in the country, a man named Sheldon Hackney, who was from Birmingham, Alabama, had married a woman from Montgomery, Alabama, whose parents were kind of civil rights legends, the Durrs, Virginia and Clifford Durr. Clifford Durr was Rosa Parks' attorney. He's the one who got her out of jail in 1955 when she refused to give up her seat. So working for Sheldon for 2 years introduced me to a world I scarcely knew existed of black and white activists, and he was also an activist and an incredible role model, and changed my life forever. So ever since then, I've tried to live up to his example. Sadly, in 2013, he died of Lou Gehrig's disease, and I was able to edit a book in his honor by a number of his former students and people who had admired him. And I've done 12 books, and almost all of them deal with civil rights and human rights and race and
which is an outstanding background for our discussion here today.
So I've done this new book is the fourth book in a series. I've kind of what I would call underappreciated, understudied civil rights figures.
Right.
I started with a book on the Freedom Rides, and then I did a book on Marian Anderson, the great black singer who was turned away from Constitution Hall by the DAR in 1939 and sang at the Lincoln Memorial. And then the third book was a biography of Arthur Ashe, the great humanitarian tennis star. And
who sadly died young.
49 years old, 93 of AIDS.
Yes.
And then the fourth book in the series is the biography of John Lewis. But they're all part of a pattern of recapturing these stories of sort of the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement.
People like me, we've all heard of, and I think now I believe we all know the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. We know the legacy of Malcolm X. We know the legacy of some other leaders whose names became household terms. And you, I guess, are looking into those that are not so much household terms.
To some degree, yes. I mean, what we call the foot soldiers of the movement. Now, some of the people I write about are leaders too, but I was once at a conference in Washington at the Senate office building. All the civil rights leaders were there. Coretta King was there. Baird Rustin, any number of people, and 1986. And Bob Moses is one of the great SNCC leaders out of Mississippi, was speaker. And he reminded the audience, Coretta King sitting right behind him, and I don't think she liked this very much, but he said, Martin was not the movement. Martin was a wave on the sea, on the ocean of the movement, but it's much larger than any individual, that we've overemphasized the power of charismatic oratory. As important as it is, certainly to inspire people, but the secret of the civil rights struggle is what ordinary people find inside themselves to make themselves larger than themselves. They invest themselves in a cause that they're willing to die for, and that's what people like John Lewis did, and Arthur Ashe did, and Marian Anderson did. And the secret of it is that ordinary people, and I don't mean to really say they're really ordinary, but ordinary people can do extraordinary things.
Right.
If they have enough courage and commitment.
Isn't that kind of the study in courage? Let me kind of interrupt you there for just
everything I do is that.
Yeah, because I read the book by John Kennedy, the PT 109, and then Profiles in Courage.
Sure.
And I've come to understand that courage is not things done by extraordinary people, but extraordinary things done by ordinary people.
Sure.
And I think about various people in the South, particularly in the American South, who had to face up against overwhelming, life-threatening situations.
Yep.
The Edmund Pettus Bridge, the bus ride, the Montgomery.
Bus boycott. Yeah.
The boycott, and all of those things. And I think about, who is it that motivates us? Who is it that causes us to understand? A guy like me, for example, a guy from white privilege, a guy flying an airplane. Who is it that causes me to accumulate that knowledge?
Yeah, it's hard to know. That's these tales of physical and moral courage. That's what I like to write about, and because I think it can be empowering. The film they made on Freedom Riders has been seen by over 60 million people around the world. Wow. And every time I've seen a screening of it, we won 3 Emmys and a Peabody. It's one of the most watched civil rights films ever made, based on my book. And
wow, that's outstanding.
I never could have reached. You're lucky if your mother-in-law reads your book. So, and I've been involved in a number of documentary films about and upcoming feature films as well that is a medium that has tremendous power to reach people. So many Americans don't know what happened in the past. They have no idea. They have no clue, and they're in a sense disarmed in any kind of moral discussion. They don't know really where their identity comes from, like white privilege. So you have to teach people about the what, and then you can make them cross the bridge to perhaps to the why. Although the why is extremely difficult to know, but it's a tremendous journey of understanding to even attempt to answer why. I would say. So that's, as a historian, that's.
Think about. I was thinking about in the category of, I guess you'd call it unsung heroes. A lady who was, I think, what would you call it, a solid citizen, a secretary at the AME church, who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus, and created literally a movement.
Yeah, I've written a lot about Rosa Parks. I knew her.
You knew Rosa Parks?
Just barely. I was one of the designers of the Rosa Parks Museum.
Oh, okay.
So when we dedicated it, she was there, and I met her. And my mentor, I was a research assistant for a young historian from Birmingham, who married into a Montgomery, Alabama family, his father-in-law was Rosa Parks' attorney.
Oh.
So at 19 years old, I encountered all of these people, black and white, in the movement, and changed my life forever.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
I'm sure it did. So you actually met Rosa Parks as a part of that museum dedication. What I read about her was that the media, which is now and always has been controlled pretty much by the privileged and the what would you say, the powerful, try to characterize Rosa Parks more or less as a rabble-rouser, a type of person who was out to create trouble. And when I read the truth of her her resume, I realized just how bad the mainstream story was.
Well, actually, I would reverse that, frankly. I mean, in fact, I'm going with a team of people to redesign the Rosa Parks Museum.
Wow.
Because there's been a lot of work that's come out on her since her death. And a lot of it shows that she was almost a lifelong activist. She wasn't just a person whose feet were tired because she'd worked all day and she didn't want to give up her seat.
No.
She'd been involved in all kinds of struggles over the previous 25 years. So she was a rebel. She was not just a simple lady. She was very dignified. She's wonderful.
Yeah.
But she had fire in her belly. But that's often missed. They try to soften her as the mother of the civil rights movement, and somehow, she had tired feet. And that demeans who she really was. Okay, so that's the way historians now see it.
Which is different, I think, than has been in the past.
That's right. That's right. And that's what we're trying to bring out in the museum.
What brought you? How did you wind up at the University of South Florida in St.
Well, I wound up at the University of South Florida because my wife is an 8th-generation Floridian, and she could only tolerate 4 winters in Minnesota. My first teaching job out of graduate school at Brandeis in Boston was the University of Minnesota. I loved it. She hated it. She lasted 4 winters, which is 4 more than I should have expected. Next thing I knew, we were headed south with a U-Haul truck, pulling our car behind to St. Petersburg to take this job here.
Yeah.
I really had I had to keep my promise that she didn't have a life sentence in Minnesota. We had our first child there, and anyway, fell in love with St. Petersburg immediately. I grew up a lot on Amelia Island on the other side of North Florida.
Right.
Really had very little experience with the Gulf, and I knew early on about the skeletons in St. Petersburg's closet, some of the darker aspects of its history. But it seemed to be a place that always had an unusual number of well-meaning people who tried to work across the color line, ministers, black and white, and just people who were trying to lead the community out of this Jim Crow nightmare. So, for example, when the Freedom Riders came here in 1961, they really had virtually no trouble. I mean, it was one of the few communities where they weren't welcome with open arms, but I mean, the St. Petersburg Times, most liberal newspaper in the South at the time, tried to make sure that there would not be the kind of violence that happened in Alabama and other places on the Freedom Rise. But so it turned out that St. Petersburg is a great place to teach about race, about regional culture. It's not really the Deep South by any means. It has an ex-Confederate past, you might say, even though the city didn't really exist till the 1880s. But it's always had a number of Northerners here, people from Europe and Canada, and it's what you might say it's the original Sun Belt city. You know, it's not narrowly defined as Southern. And so I think that's given it a kind of a leaven of at least moderation, if not liberalism, that has given it a chance to work this poison out of its system. So it was an intriguing place to have students from all over the country, really, and all over the world. Unlike my friends who taught in Mississippi and Alabama, I think sometimes they felt crushed by the orthodoxy of the kind of neo-Confederate mythology, white privilege, and all of that. And I thought it was very liberating here, and wonderful academic freedom and support. And I immediately became an activist in the city, and nobody at the university ever gave me a moment's worth of trouble about it, which is striking now, considering what's been happening with Governor DeSantis and the right-wing Republicans in the legislature, mandating a kind of move towards an autocratic society that has almost no tolerance for any dissent, and no interest in these kind of humane values that I believe in and I've tried to fight for. So,
do you think that USF today, you would have the same career experience today that you had in year two?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know. I worry that if I was still teaching and was as active as I've always been, I might have been in some real trouble. Yeah. That my friends joke I would be in jail if I'd taught the last 2 years, but I don't know. I mean, Florida has a long history of repression of freedom of speech. There was a time when a couple of professors at the University of Florida were fired because they weren't sufficiently pro-Confederate in their teaching. The Johns Committee, the infamous Johns Committee, between 1956 and 1965, was trying to root out communists, as they called them, and homosexuals and dissidents and deviants, as they would call them. Hundreds of people got fired because of the Johns Committee.
And that was in the 1950s.
56 to 65.
And it mirrored the McCarthy era.
Right. It was kind of a Florida form of McCarthyism. Yeah. But as severe as any repression in the country. And we worked our way out of that, only now to have a kind of a return to the era of Charlie Johns and his crusaders, and nearly destroyed University of South Florida, which was in 1962, was the only desegregated public university in Florida, way before FSU, way before Florida, way before any of the others, and so it was a target. And they had a lot of kind of avant-garde people on the faculty, and they became targets. And
Florida has a reputation now, actually, of having more organized hate groups than virtually any other state of its, comparable state.
I think that's right. I in the summers for a number of years, I led civil rights tours to the Deep South. These kind of 8-day, only the strong will survive kind of tours. Life-changing for the people who went on them. I think I had them meet civil rights veterans and go to movement churches and talk to judges and journalists, and they really heard testimony by people who barely survived. the civil rights years, and that was really eye-opening for me. So we used to say that, well, we may be bad in Florida, but we're not as bad as Alabama and Mississippi.
That's not true.
Thank God for Alabama and Mississippi. Well, now they're saying thank God for Florida.
Yeah.
Because we're even worse than they are in some respects, which
you
is
mentioned
sad.
Dr. Arsenault, you mentioned kind of a history. You might not have couched it this way I did. Historical illiteracy. In other words, that people do not understand. They don't know. They haven't read. The old adage, those who don't read history are doomed to repeat it. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well,
in the context.
Sure. Well, in my experience as a teacher, I found a couple of things. One, that most of my students had almost no knowledge of anything beyond Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They really didn't understand civil rights as a social movement, as a movement that had leaders and sort of foot soldiers. But when they discovered it, it was just electric. Some of them ended up going on these tours with me, and that had an even deeper impact, I think. But just in taking the courses and learning about these things, it was jaw-dropping for many of them. And I think many of them were never the same again. When they encountered this, they sort of would ask me, well, why didn't anybody else ever tell us about these things? And for a number of years, I ran teacher workshops for K through 12 teachers, mostly secondary school history and geography teachers, and they were getting humanities enrichment, these grants from the Florida Humanities Council. So they were among the best teachers, but I came to really admire them because they wanted so much to take their students beyond the textbook, to really reach them, and yet they found it difficult. They're taught to teach to the test. Don't get off the standard agenda, or administrators were nervous, and that was 10, 15 years ago.
Today,
I cannot imagine what it's like right now to be a K through 12 teacher, with all the things buffeting you in terms of when you're trying to do an intellectually,
how about intellectually honest?
Well, intellectually honest, but something that challenges your students to.
Yeah.
We just don't do a very good job of history education. I mean, the history profession is better than it's ever been. I mean, the quality of the work being done is extraordinary. But there's all this emphasis on STEM,
yes,
and away from the humanities. And I think it's just a terrible, terrible mistake. And the political consequences, the consequences for American democracy are just frightening, I think, in what may happen over the long term. So I always felt a real calling to try to bring at least as much of this as I could to my students and to the general public. So I worked very hard as a public historian, consulting for museums and media and lecturing all over the world on these things. And I often found that in Europe, for example, or even in the Middle East, I found some people knew more about American history than most Americans do. It was really, now they of course were probably particularly interested in the whole questions of race and may explain part of it, but I
want to interject something here. I know, Dr. Arsenault, you don't have unlimited time, and I'm really soaking up what you're saying, and it's very important to me that we go farther with these discussions. But I want to throw out a thing I was going to say earlier, and I think now's a good time to do it. I remember, because I'm old, so I remember the civil rights movement. In fact, I remember the 60s, everything about the 60s, which was pretty massive on all kinds of fields. But I remember Malcolm X saying publicly, Martin Luther King needs me, and I need Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. He had a perspective that I surely didn't understand. Can you comment on that for
Sure.
us?
Well, you're referring to Malcolm X of his last 2 years.
Yes.
He went through a dramatic transformation after he visited Africa and Saudi Arabia, and came much more to appreciate Dr. King.
Yeah.
And in fact, he visited Selma before the Selma and Montgomery March in 1965, just before his own assassination,
Right.
and was very sort of conciliatory, really, in terms of different parts of the movement, and he was not as harsh as he had been, and I think that's the Malcolm X that I like to remember. John Lewis, who I've just written a book about, met Malcolm X in Ethiopia in 1964, I think it was, and it was fascinating to kind of try to recapture the dialogue they had in terms of, Lewis being the quintessential nonviolent
Right.
crusader who never raised his hand to anyone, and Malcolm X, who some people saw as a kind of a prophet of violence. What Malcolm X was saying is that, if you don't deal with Dr. King, you'll have to deal with me.
Yeah.
and there is some truth to that. I think that having Malcolm X in the background as a kind of threat maybe made some people more amenable to dealing with the nonviolent part of the movement. But I think nonviolence itself had such an integrity and such an impact on the people who opened up their minds to it. It never became the mass movement that Dr. King dreamed of. He really ended his life with a sense of failure, really, that the movement had turned against him after he openly opposed the Vietnam War, and when he talked more about economic justice, the kind of the radical version of Dr. King. He was always radical in his own way, certainly, but I think that of those people who did sort of drink the Kool-Aid, you might say, who saw the power of nonviolence, of how it worked during the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56, and the sit-ins of 1960, and the freedom rides of 1961, and Selma and Montgomery March, and the spirit of the March on Washington in 63, and Birmingham, of course, the great confrontation there. It was, not everybody adopted nonviolence as a philosophy of life the way John Lewis did. But many other people adopted it at least as a tactic that worked.
Yeah.
That was the best way out in a society that was armed and dangerous. There's so many guns in this country, and if you're outnumbered and you're outgunned, you probably don't want to pick a violent fight with the majority.
For me,
you're not going to win it.
I pick a vision when I think back, and I talk about courage to do things, Rosa Parks or whoever. Mm-hmm. I get a picture of the confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Mm-hmm. I get that picture in my mind. It seemed that Dr. King and other leaders were faced with a choice. They were faced with which way are we going to go in the face of, who was it, Jim Clark and
Jim Clark was
the bullies of the Old South.
Right.
And
Al Lingo from the State Patrol, yes.
And there's these standoff, and I picture this in my mind on that bridge, that it was kind of a momentous history.
Sure. Well, there are 3 photographs in my book you can see about Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it was probably the signature moment of John Lewis's life. It's a complicated story, and Dr. King was not really at the center of it, even though in the film Selma he's made to be the center, but he really wasn't. The leader of the voting rights struggle there was Bernard Lafayette, who's actually from Tampa and who's still alive.
Wow.
Sometimes comes here to lecture. He was known as the little Gandhi of the movement, and King was certainly involved, but it's all. There was a whole local movement against incredible odds in Selma and the surrounding counties. And when John Lewis led 600 people across that bridge,
Yeah.
and then there he's faced by the police and the state troopers, and they attack.
The county sheriff.
Yeah.
Supposed to be the lawman in the county.
Well, Jim Clark was the sort of the ringleader. That's true, but Lewis was nearly beaten to death, as others were, and ultimately he was beaten 45 times. He was arrested 45 times. Wow. It's a miracle he survived until 2020.
It is.
It's really unbelievable. But in Selma, the segregationist South sort of showed its true colors, in a sense, that underlying segregation and discrimination was a culture of violence.
Yeah. And
they did it in front of all those television cameras and all those reporters. And something snapped, I think, in people, some people at least. So if this is what we have to do to maintain this system, maybe, just maybe, there's something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Same thing happened in Birmingham in '63 with the attack dogs and the high-pressure fire hoses that Bull Connor turned on the so-called Children's Crusade, the young kids who joined the marches in Birmingham.
Mississippi '64.
Well, Freedom Summer, yes, for sure. Sure, yeah. Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney being killed, but part of what it demonstrates is the power of prophetic religion. I mean, it went beyond political liberalism or radicalism. When the Freedom Rides, all those 300 kids basically were thrown into Parchman Prison, the worst prison in America, and the white power structure in Mississippi, and even the Kennedy administration thought it would work, that they'd go screaming home to their parents, once they got into a real jail. But exactly the opposite happened. I mean, they fancied themselves as Gandhian crusaders who were supposed to sort of revel in unmerited suffering. That's how you get your stripes, so to speak, as a nonviolent warrior. And so they turned Parchman Prison into a university of nonviolence. And all those tactics that had been working for generations to intimidate civil rights advocates, particularly young black males, they all backfired. I almost felt sorry for the white supremacists because they didn't know who they were dealing with. They were dealing people who they could kill them, and their place would be filled by 10 more people. And it was the same power that Gandhi demonstrated in India. And King became a kind of American Gandhi, if you will.
One of my studies, things I've studied over the year, told you about courage and other things, is Texas politicians particularly. One of them being Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of '64, mm-hmm. But mainly, more importantly actually to me than that, was his move to force the Voting Rights Act of '65 through a Congress at a time when he himself was had not been known as a great champion of civil rights. But oddly, the story I finally gleaned was that he had told Dr. King, no, we can't, it's too fast, I can't do it. And yet he was goaded into it by none other than George Wallace because of the voting suppression.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a famous confrontation where he called George Wallace up to the White House and gave him a tongue lashing.
Yeah.
And but in some ways, Johnson needed Wallace, just in the way the movement needed Bull Connor in Birmingham. You need someone who's not afraid to show the ugly side of segregation and racism. But I think in Johnson's case, the cat was already out of the bag. When he pushed through a very strong Civil Rights Act, Public Accommodations Act in 1964, he lost a lot of the conservative white South. He knew it. And he didn't really have much to lose in '65. Politically, he thought, well, if nothing else, we're going to get a lot of black people voting, and that will help the situation ultimately. And he was right about that. I mean, the Democratic Party in the South today is largely, not largely, but certainly a very big part of it is African Americans. Right. And and well-meaning white people. So I mean, Lyndon Johnson's complicated, really, to figure out. I mean, he ultimately, what he did to Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in '64 was, I think, unconscionable, because he sort of lost his nerve, really, and he couldn't go as far or as fast as the movement was going, but they kept pushing him. I mean, to his credit, he did support those two major acts, which we thought would leave a permanent legacy. Of course, now we've had the Voting Rights Act completely gutted, and I think that was...
But I do remember Johnson, who, above all, was an extremely practical politician, who did say, by forcing this, I have ceded the entire South to the Republicans for 50 years. That was probably prophetic.
It was, but I wouldn't describe that as being a practical politician. I mean, that's the one time when he made a real sacrifice. He didn't play politics. He realized that, I think the Civil Rights Movement demonstrated to him how important this was. I think he had a natural kind of sympathy for the underdog when he was growing up in Texas, and sympathy for Hispanics, and even though he could use racial epithets and be vulgar and crude and all of that, I think deep down he had a kind of a good heart.
Yeah.
And usually the practical politics overwhelmed that, actually, but it didn't.
Yeah.
In '64 and '65.
That's what I meant when I said above all, he had been a practical politician.
Well, that's right, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible, really, that it happened. But in some ways, you can see that it took a Southerner to do this.
Yeah.
That in the same way that it took a conservative Republican like Nixon to open to China.
Yeah.
They can do it without the total kind of political fallout that might befall someone else of a different political stripe. But I mean, the drama of those years is extraordinary. I mean, as you know, so it's a great high point of the movement after the Selma and Montgomery March. That's really the precondition for it. The Voting Rights Act passes, Johnson rams it through, and then a week later you have the Watts riot.
The people...
And so many whites say, what do these black people want? They're so ungrateful. We gave them the Voting Rights Act, and here they are burning down their own neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And of course, what's happening there is that for so many years the movement was oriented towards civil rights, right, and not really the deeper freedom struggle. Historians now don't generally use the term civil rights movement anymore. It's really the African American freedom struggle, which means something broader than just getting entree into the political system. I mean, they realized that they could get voting rights and they could get public accommodations, but it wouldn't change the structural racism in the economy, right, in housing. Their lives were... They had the right to go get a hamburger at a lunch counter, but they didn't have any money to do it.
Money.
And so there's almost a built-in disillusionment there that Watts represents. And of course, that also shows that outside the South, the urban, the kind of level of tension and of despair is greater outside the South than it is in the South.
Yeah,
and Watts showed that, and of course, the riots in Detroit and elsewhere.
And I think your comment that it took a Southerner to do the 64, 65 thing is evidenced by this. How in the world could anybody else have gotten John Stennis of Mississippi to vote for the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act? And it took Lyndon Johnson to do that. Yeah.
Well, another part of that, I think, is that one of the underappreciated elements of the Civil Rights Movement were the white Southerners. Sometimes they were the only people in their town. If you were a civil rights worker in the South, you knew in most towns there was a safe house, maybe one house, one family, one church,
one place
where you'd be safe. But when those white Southerners crossed the line, often at the again, putting themselves against their families, their ministers, their teachers, their whole heritage, that's a life-changing decision. You don't go back on that. Once you cross that Rubicon, you're a civil rights person for life. Forever. And many of those white Southerners involved in the movement were not only heroic, but incredibly important in kind of cracking the mold, cracking the mystique of Jim Crow, that not every white person, is an enemy. And that's, of course, was the lesson of the Freedom Rides. Half of the Freedom Riders were white. half of them from outside the South, and yet they were willing to put their lives on the line. Like the others, they wrote their last will and testament before they got on those buses because they knew the Klan might kill them. And I think that has a profound effect on African American people who realize they're not alone.
Yeah.
Even though there's going to be a turn towards violence and towards black separatism and black cultural nationalism and all those things that happened in the late 60s, which are discouraging, it's not permanent. Right. And there's a real interracial aspect to the movement, interregional. Some of it's secular, some of it's religious. It's America, and that was the secret of the Freedom Rides, is that it could be the kid next door could be a Freedom Rider. I mean, the son-in-law of Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, was a Freedom Rider. There were secretaries and mechanics and rabbis and every possible combination. And
given what's happened since, I would say that this is just me with no authority from anybody. Dr. King, if he were able to step into St. Pete today or Selma or anywhere today, he would feel like a failure because of what has happened in recent history. The movement seems to have peaked and then institutionalized, and now such a right-wing push in this country.
Well, I think the movement's still going. I mean, I think that's sometimes misunderstood. I mean, when King is assassinated in '68, the movement fragments, and there's no one person who can take King's place, certainly. But he has a lot of disciples. I mean, look at what John Lewis did for the rest of his life, and Andy Young, and Jesse Jackson, and any number of people who.
Julian Bond, I guess.
Julian and any number of people who kept the faith. Yeah. So I know John Lewis once said that every time I hear somebody say, and usually it was African Americans who would say this, well, nothing's changed. Yeah. He said, walk in my shoes. If you had gone through my life and seen what it was like when I was growing up in rural Pike County, when I was considered subhuman, and I couldn't even use the public library, and I couldn't, use the water fountains, or I couldn't, I was just, there was no hope, it seemed, at that time, and so the movement did really affect change. It didn't bring the beloved community. That was Lewis's disappointment, and so much of the change came from. Well, pragmatic politics. I mean, you were able to get laws passed, and I think what John Lewis was dreaming about and King was dreaming about was a transformation of the human heart, something deeper than legal change. Even though you need the legal change, certainly it's important, but you can't mandate someone to love you.
De jure is okay, de facto is necessary, and I think those are the divisions probably.
Well, I mean, yeah, in a sense, in the South, you had de jure segregation in law, so you could attack those laws. You knew what the enemy was, and once you got them changed, there was some hope that things would gradually change for the better. In the North, and of course, you had de facto segregation, which was more difficult to get people to admit or to recognize their own prejudices.
Even acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah, I taught for 4 years in Minnesota, and where even though that becomes the scene for George Floyd, at that time, most of my students had no idea, that there was anything that they were complicit at all in this system, and so that at least there are lots of awful things about the complex of racism in Southern history, but at least it was out there.
As a wrap-up point, Dr. Arsenault, again, thank you. I can't thank you enough for being on.
My pleasure.
For being on No Hate Radio. But I told you, as impossible as it may be, why and what are we going to do about it? What do you think now we're going to do about it?
Well, I think this is something that the great civil rights leader Diane Nash, who was one of the coordinators of the Freedom Riders, said to me once. She said, "It's it's not just enough to vote the right way. You've got to become people have got to become active citizens. They've got to speak out in the course of their life. They've got to sort of live this dream in a way of modeling the kind of behavior that they believe in, like be the change that you want. And I think we have to mobilize people. I wish that there was more of a spirit of nonviolence. I wish that people would be more involved in passive resistance. You would think that with what's happening in Florida, there'd be enough people who would be willing to go to Tallahassee and shut the government down.
Yeah.
With sit-ins and clogging the streets and until something happened, to start to mitigate this situation. But most people don't have that kind of possibility in them. At least somehow it hasn't been awakened. But even if they can't do that, just by being decent to other human beings, maybe particularly those who look different than they. Yeah. Jim Lawson, who was one of the great teachers of the movement. I heard him once when we were doing a recreation of the Freedom Ride. We had 192 students on all these buses with 10 Freedom Riders going from Nashville to Birmingham. And I remember somebody asking him, "What can I do?" These kids were intimidated by law. Lawson could intimidate anybody. He was in force of nature. But he had a simple answer. He said, just acts of kindness, acts of generosity. That's where you can start, and that it's amazing at what that can grow into, what that can become. Not everybody can be a John Lewis or Martin Luther King, but you can try to live out the values that you believe in, and I think it's a way of spreading the joy and the hope that I don't know what else we can do. I think
I want to take note that right there, what you just said, is going to culminate this episode. It's going to be the crescendo, because what are we going to do about it? According to Ray Arsenault, we're going to be kind. We're going to treat people decent. We're going to do the right thing when the right thing needs to be done.
Yeah, I think that's what's so troubling about Donald Trump, is that he acts exactly the opposite model of human behavior, cheating and lying and demeaning people and just this hateful kind of view of the world outside of yourself. And we've got to combat that, and we've got to stop it now, because that also is infectious.
Oh yeah,
and can spread, and people take their cues from politicians, and so we need more politicians who can speak in the idiom of John Lewis, about the politics of love and the beloved community, and I've seen it in the talks I've given throughout my career, how people respond to this.
They do.
It's just they're desperate for it if you can just show them this alternative. So that's
Dr.
a little bit of hope, I hope.
Dr. Ray Arsenault here has written a new book, and
it's called John Lewis in Search of the Beloved Community.
Yeah. Who's publishing it?
Yale University Press. It's in a new series called Black Lives.
Black Lives.
They've just started it, and mine will be the third. 2 have come out, and mine is the third, all over the country. And I'm going to be doing signings and lectures all over the country, and there'll be a lot of media coverage. And I'm going to be doing Tomalo Books and probably Studio at 620, and I certainly could do a signing here, for sure.
That'd be great. Thank you for being on No Hate Radio today.
My pleasure.
All right.
If you'd like to contribute to No Hate Radio, you can call in and record a message on the No Hate Radio hotline, 442-4-NO-HATE. That's 442-466-4283. Or you can reach out via email at nohateradio@allendaleequityjustice.org.